When I think about questions and fears and hopes related to refugees and immigrants today, whether held by the immigrants and refugees or by native-born Americans, my natural inclination as a historian is to look to the past to help us understand the present and where we're heading in the future. I want to start with an episode from the spring of 1939. A ship, the St. Louis, sailed from Germany with Jewish refugees to North America. First, it stopped in Cuba, which was an American colony at the time. Some Jews were let off the ship into Cuba because they had visas, but over 900 of the refugees were refused entry. So the ship sailed on to the United States. The American president, Franklin Roosevelt, and his staff thought about the issue and then denied entry to the Jews. Not only that, it sent a couple of frigates to prevent the ship from running itself aground so the refugees could get onto shore that way. The ship then sailed on to Canada, where again, government officials thought about the question and again denied entry to the refugees. So the ship sailed back to Europe. Countries in Europe, notably Great Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and a few others, accepted the Jewish refugees. Eventually, however, during World War II, over a quarter of them were killed in the death camps. The episode in 1939 is important in a couple of ways. It helps us to understand a general pattern in American history going back to the early 19th century and carrying forward into the present. In 1939, the primary reason why those Jewish refugees were rejected was anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism had religious components. The Jews weren't Christians, and anti-Semites often saw them as enemies of Christianity as well as threats to the nation. The anti-Semitism also was racial. Jews were a different race, and they were ill-suited and ill-fitted for a country like the United States. There were other components to this as well, of course. It was the Great Depression, and this was a time when unemployment was high, when Americans feared that the economy was in turmoil, and they saw immigrants, even refugees, as a threat to the nation economically or to their jobs as well. Most of us remember, of course, with horror, the Holocaust that followed during World War II. And so many people, Jews of course, but also many other people, including many Americans, have since then said, never again will we allow this kind of thing to happen. In the present, once again, we're regularly confronted with refugees, some of them fleeing political danger, some of them fleeing religious danger, many immigrants simply looking for opportunities economically and politically. Once again, we're presented with this question: what do we do with refugees? When we think about the United States as a nation, it's helpful to think about what is nationalism? How do people conceive of their nation? What makes it special? What makes it unique? There are two kinds of nationalism. One we can call civic nationalism. In civic nationalism, the core way a people think of themselves is by their basic political, social, and economic values. With civic nationalism, the idea is that anyone who accepts those basic political values and is loyal to the nation in that regard, whatever his or her ethnic, racial, cultural, or religious background, they can become a full citizen of the United States and be welcomed as a fellow American. The other kind of nationalism is ethnic nationalism. There, the identity of the nation is seen as being tied to a particular religious group. In the United States, going back to the late colonial period and the early 19th century, that was Protestant Christians. In addition, the nation is typically identified with an ethnic or racial group. In the United States, in the new nation, it was people from Northern and Western Europe and Great Britain, so Dutch, German, Scottish, English, Welsh, and so on. By contrast, other groups, culturally, ethnically, racially, and religiously, were seen as unfit and ill-suited for the nation. In the civic tradition, if you accept values, the political values of the nation, you can be welcomed. In the ethnic nationalist tradition, being a member of a nation is something you're born into. You can't change your ethnic background. You can't change your racial background. So a key difference between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism is the ability of newcomers to find their place in the nation. In American history, and similarly in Canadian history, we see cycles where ethnic nationalism comes to the fore and plays a dominant role in shaping politics, and periods where civic nationalism comes to the fore and plays the dominant role in politics. The negative side of nationalism, whatever form it takes, is often called nativism by scholars. That is, anti-immigrant movements or anti-refugee movements by native-born Americans or Canadians who fear the impact of migrants to their nation. When we look to American history then, we can see an enduring conflict between the ethnic and the civic versions of nationalism. We can see cycles of nativism, of anti-immigrant movements, and periods of welcoming immigrants, including refugees. And we can see that these cycles fall along pretty predictable lines in terms of which ethnic groups are unwanted or not preferred, and which religious groups are unwanted and not preferred. But it's important to notice, however, that these groups evolve over time. An example of what I mean by things evolving over time is that one generation's immigrant group, sometimes an unwanted group, often 2 or 3 generations later, becomes nativists and begin questioning whether new kinds of immigrants are a threat to the United States. So people who once themselves were perceived as a threat can, over time, begin to perceive other newcomers as a threat. I've experienced this a little bit myself. My parents both emigrated from the Netherlands to Canada after World War II. My mother's family in the 1940s and my father's family in the 1950s. So I grew up among Dutch immigrants in Canada in the 1970s and 80s. I can remember in the 1980s and 1990s with refugee groups coming from different parts of East Asia, for example, Vietnamese refugees in the wake of the war in Vietnam, and with growing numbers of immigrants to Canada coming from places like the Caribbean and Africa. I remember people in the Dutch-Canadian community worrying about these newcomers, whether they would fit in Canada. These people were themselves often immigrants from the 1940s and 50s, and they were now anticipating, thinking about closing the door to current immigrants. Of course, other people in the community pushed back and said, we were immigrants too, and we didn't always feel welcome, so we should continue to welcome new immigrants and try to help them feel at home. But that divide very quickly developed among the Dutch-Canadian community in my experience as a teenager and a college student. A more historical example would be the Irish, who were unwanted immigrants in the 1840s and 50s. By the 1870s and 80s, especially among middle-class Irish, who felt more accepted, more mainstream, they started to fear now immigrants from Southern Europe, such as Italians and Greeks, or from Eastern Europe, Poles, Russians, and Jews. So, what do we learn from all of this history? As a historian, I'm a little bit leery of drawing lessons from the past. There never are guarantees in history, but there are some important ones we can learn here. People that we once feared as them, outsiders, unwanted, incompatible with American society and culture, such as Catholics and Jews, become part of us. We once, or at least nativists, once thought of the American nation as Protestant. Today, people often talk about it as a Christian or a Judeo-Christian nation. They have become part of us. We can be confident that, given time, Muslim Americans, whether they come as migrants seeking jobs or political freedom, whether they come as refugees, given time to adjust to the United States, just like immigrants in the past, and given time for Americans to adjust to a new people, increasingly we will think of them as part of us. The Refugee and Immigration Collaborative, connecting global neighbors. This collaborative was brought together with support from Calvin College, the Calvin Alumni Association, and the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship.